The first sound was not screaming. It was the tide, low water pulling back from the sand, gulls circling, the familiar rhythm of a morning that had repeated itself for generations. Lindisfarne had always trusted the sea to keep the world away. The island rose quietly from the coast of Northumbria, reachable only when the water allowed it. At other times, it was sealed off, cut from roads, armies, and trouble. That isolation was not accidental, it was spiritual design. On this morning, in the late 8th century, the community woke as it always had. Bells, bare feet on stone, breath fogging the air inside cold walls, prayer before light, work before speech. The nuns of Lindisfarne had chosen removal from the world, believing distance brought protection. By the end of this story, you will understand why that belief collapsed in a single morning, and why what followed was recorded so carefully in grief and so vaguely in detail, because the worst part was not what happened quickly, it was what happened after. The first ships appeared low on the horizon, dark against the pale water. Not many, not enough to cause alarm. Traders passed this coast. Fishermen too. No horns were blown, no warning fires lit. There was no reason to believe the island was about to be entered by force. That assumption lasted until the sails did not turn away. The boats came straight in. What the chronicles don't tell you immediately is how little time there was between recognition and impact. The distance from sea to shore closed faster than anyone expected. Oars bit water with practiced rhythm. The hulls scraped sand. Men jumped down, already moving. They did not pause. They did not speak. They carried axes, blades, and the confidence of men who knew exactly how long they could remain before consequences arrived. The imbalance was immediate. Lindisfarne had no defenders in waiting, no armed guard, no walls to slow an advance. The monastery was not built to repel violence. It was built to invite silence. The women who lived there were not trained to resist, but to endure. That distinction mattered. The first deaths were abrupt. Those in the open, those who froze, those who tried to interpose their bodies between others and the attackers. There was no formation, no line, just speed and proximity. Violence moved faster than comprehension, but killing was not the objective. This is where the story becomes harder to tell. The attackers began separating people. Some were struck down and left. Others were restrained, pulled away from familiar spaces, taken from rooms where they had spent their lives. The logic was not random. It was practiced. The Vikings understood value. Objects could be taken quickly. Chalices, reliquaries, manuscripts, adorned with metal. But people were more complex. They took time to sort, to assess, to decide who lived long enough to be useful. For the nuns, survival was not relief. It was the beginning of a different kind of violence. Witnesses later wrote of shock, not just at the blood, but at the inversion of meaning. Sacred spaces entered without hesitation, holy objects handled without reverence. Women who had defined themselves by separation from the world, suddenly exposed to its most brutal appetite. Fear did not arrive all at once. It spread. First there was disbelief, then panic, then the realization that prayer did not interrupt what was happening, that the rules they had organized their lives around were not being acknowledged. This is where everything shifted. Those taken alive were bound, not gently, not with concern for injury, hands behind backs, rope biting skin, movement forced. The geography of the island, once a comfort, became a funnel. There was nowhere to hide that had not already been searched. The boats waited. What happened next shocked even those who later tried to explain it. Some were killed before the ships left. Others were loaded aboard, forced down into hulls that smelled of salt, pitch, and previous journeys. The sea that had once protected Lindisfarne now carried its people away from it. This was not chaos. It was procedure. The Vikings did not linger to dominate the island. They did not claim it. They stripped it, emptied it, and departed before any organized response could reach the shore. The entire assault lasted hours, not days. But the damage was not measured in time. Those left behind found bodies where prayer had once filled the air. They found silence where routine had governed every hour. And they found absence, spaces where people had been, now emptied so completely it felt intentional. News spread unevenly, not as a clear account, but as fragments. A holy place, violated, women taken, God's house entered by force. The language used to describe it was careful, almost restrained. Chroniclers wrote of suffering and captivity, of trials beyond endurance. They did not elaborate. That restraint was not accidental. To describe fully what had happened, to those taken, to those forced to witness, to those carried away, would have required confronting a truth the church was not prepared to make central. That withdrawal from the world did not guarantee protection from it, and that some forms of survival could erase a person more completely than death. The sea crossing was short. That was the first cruelty. Those taken from Lindisfarne did not disappear over weeks or months. They were not given time to accept separation. The island fell out of sight quickly, swallowed by mist and distance, leaving behind only the certainty that return was unlikely. Below deck, there was no space to sit upright. The hulls were built for cargo, not people. Bodies were pressed together, bound, shifting with the movement of water. Salt burned skin already scraped raw by rope. The air was wet and stale. Each breath tasted of pitch and fear. This is where survival began to change its meaning. The captors did not speak to them. They did not need to. Commands were physical. Direction was given through force. Those who resisted were struck, not to kill, but to instruct. Violence here was corrective, not explosive. That distinction mattered. The Vikings were not improvising. They were executing a pattern refined over years of coastal raids. They understood which captives were liabilities and which were assets. The weak slowed movement, the defiant invited punishment, the compliant endured longer. For the nuns, endurance was a new concept. Their lives had been built around control of the body, fasting, silence, ritual, denial, but none of that prepared them for a world where their bodies were no longer their own to regulate. What the chronicles don't tell you, what they avoid naming, is how quickly identity was dismantled. Names were irrelevant, vows meaningless. The habits that marked them as separate were stripped away, sometimes literally, sometimes through forced labour that erased distinction. Modesty was not attacked for its own sake. It was dismantled because it had no value to the captors. This is where survival became a punishment. The journey did not end at the shore. Captives were marched inland or transferred between ships. Time blurred. Days were not marked by prayer, but by exhaustion. Food was irregular, water rationed. Compliance brought marginal relief. Resistance brought suffering, and all of it was intentional. The goal was not immediate profit. It was conditioning. People who could be sold, traded, or integrated needed to be broken first. Not physically destroyed, but reshaped. Fear was the tool. Uncertainty was the environment. Isolation did the rest. Some captives were separated early. This decision sealed their fate. Those taken away individually vanished into silence, absorbed into households, markets, or networks that left no record. Those kept together lasted longer, but suffered differently. Watching others disappear without explanation created a new kind of terror, the fear of selection. Every pause in movement became a moment of dread. Every inspection, a threat. Survival was no longer about strength, but about invisibility, being neither useful enough to isolate nor defiant enough to punish. For women who had defined themselves through spiritual identity, this erosion was total. They were denied ritual, denied prayer, denied the structure that had once ordered every hour. Days collapsed into formless endurance. Time lost meaning. The self followed. This is where everything goes wrong psychologically. The captors did not need to escalate violence constantly. The possibility was enough. The memory of what had already occurred did the work for them. Fear became internalized. Discipline self-enforced. Chroniclers later wrote of humiliation and shame. But those words flatten the experience. What occurred was not a single violation, but a sustained dismantling of personhood, and the world allowed it. No rescue came, no pursuit followed. Lindisfarne's attackers were not chased down. The political reality of the time, fragmented kingdoms, distant authority, meant outrage did not translate into action. This absence mattered. For the captives, it confirmed what they were beginning to understand, that they were no longer protected by the structures that had once defined them. They existed now in a space where survival was conditional and reversible. Some did not survive the journey. Illness, injury, despair, death came quietly, without ceremony. Bodies were discarded without record. No rites, no names spoken. Their absence registered only as gaps among the living. Those who lived carried something else forward. Memory, but even memory was dangerous. To remember who they had been was to experience loss repeatedly. To forget was to adapt. An adaptation, in this context, required surrendering pieces of the self. This is why later accounts are fragmented, not because nothing happened, but because what happened resisted clean telling. It did not fit the frameworks of martyrdom or battlefield heroism. It was slow, ambiguous, survivable, and therefore harder to sanctify. By the time news of the raid hardened into narrative, the worst elements had already begun to blur. Chroniclers focus on the violation of sacred space, the theft of relics, the shock to Christendom. They did not dwell on those who lived on in captivity, because their existence complicated the story. Lindisfarne did not end when the ships vanished. That was the final mistake, believing the catastrophe had a boundary. The island was rebuilt. The stones were set back in place. Prayers resumed. New hands copied old texts. On the surface, continuity returned. But beneath it, something fundamental had shifted, and everyone along the coast felt it. Fear did not arrive as panic. It arrived as calculation. Monasteries began moving inland. Treasures were hidden or dispersed. Bells were rung earlier. Lookouts posted where none had been before. None of this was formal policy. There was no centralized decree. It was instinct spreading faster than authority could name it, because Lindisfarne had proven something terrifyingly simple. Sacred space did not stop violence. The chroniclers understood this, even as they struggled to frame it. Their accounts emphasized shock and sacrilege, but they stopped short of confrontation. The language was reverent, restrained, almost evasive. They spoke of God's punishment, of testing, of mystery. But here's what they didn't tell you. Silence became a tool. Those who survived captivity, those who returned, escaped, or were ransomed, did not become central figures in the story. They were not celebrated. They were not canonized. Their experiences did not fit the existing models of meaning. They had not died for the faith. They had lived through something that defied it, and that made them difficult. Survival, in this context, raised questions the church was unprepared to answer. What did it mean to endure humiliation and remain holy? What happened to vows when force intervened? Where did purity reside when control was taken away? There were no clean answers. So the stories were softened, details omitted, focus shifted to objects stolen, rather than people taken. Relics could be recovered, buildings restored. Lives fractured by captivity were less easily repaired and more easily ignored. This is where erasure began. Not dramatic erasure, not deliberate censorship, but a quiet narrowing of narrative. What could not be integrated into doctrine was allowed to fade, and yet the impact spread. The psychological shock of Lindisfarne rippled outward, changing how communities understood safety. Coastal settlements thinned, monasteries fortified or relocated. The sea, once a boundary, became a threat vector. Viking raids multiplied, not because Lindisfarne invited them, but because it demonstrated feasibility, speed, vulnerability, return without consequence. What happened next shocked even seasoned leaders. There was no immediate military response capable of stopping the pattern. England's political landscape was fragmented. Kingdoms competed rather than coordinated. Raids became a recurring terror, unpredictable and fast. impossible to meet head-on. And through all of it, the memory of Lindisfarne lingered, not as a specific event, but as a reference point, a moment when assumptions collapsed. For the survivors, time did not heal. Those who returned carried a kind of isolation more complete than any vow of withdrawal. Their experience separated them from both the world they had left and the one they re-entered. They had seen something that did not translate cleanly into language others could accept. Some withdrew entirely. Others were absorbed into quiet roles, their past unspoken. Their presence became a reminder of vulnerability in a society that needed certainty. This is why archaeology matters. Centuries later, fragments resurface, signs of hurried abandonment, changes in construction, defensive adaptations that appear suddenly without formal explanation. They speak to fear institutionalized, made permanent. The physical evidence aligns with the silences in the texts. What is not written is often as revealing as what is. Lindisfarne becomes, in hindsight, the opening wound of an age, not because it was the first act of violence, but because it was the first to shatter the illusion that faith, distance, or sanctity could guarantee protection. And the nuns, those most vulnerable, most erased, sit at the center of that realization. Their suffering did not end on the shore. It extended through captivity, through silence, through omission, through history's reluctance to name what survival cost them. This is the final irony. The raid is remembered as a beginning, the devastation of a holy place, the arrival of the Vikings. But for those taken alive, it was not a beginning. It was an ending that never fully resolved. The sea still pulls back from Lindisfarne. The tide still reveals the path. But now that path carries a different meaning. It leads not just to an island, but to a moment when the world learned that some catastrophes do not conclude with death. They continue quietly in the spaces history chooses not to fill. Lindisfarne is remembered as a raid, a date in a chronicle, a turning point in history books, a symbol marking the beginning of the Viking Age. But that framing is convenient. It allows the story to end at the shoreline, where ships depart and violence appears to conclude. What it avoids is what followed for those who lived, for those whose suffering did not fit the language of martyrdom or victory, for those whose survival carried a cost history struggled to name. The nuns of Lindisfarne were not erased by death. They were erased by silence, and that silence spread into texts, into memory, into the way the past chose to remember itself. If you want more stories where history is stripped of myth and forced to confront what really endured, where survival is examined as carefully as violence, and where the past is allowed to remain uncomfortable, subscribe to the channel. New documentaries uncover the moments history learned to look away. If there is a story you believe was softened, shortened, or deliberately forgotten, leave it in the comments. Some histories end in blood, others end in silence, and those are often the hardest to face.